The dust cloud on the horizon looked like something out of a fever dream, a writhing serpent of red earth that twisted away into the desert morning. And when Helena Fairmont finally stopped coughing long enough to realize what it meant, her heart dropped into her stomach like a stone down a well. They were gone. The Carmichael traveling carnival and medicine show had packed up and vanished while she had been in town buying thread for costume repairs, leaving nothing behind but wagon wheel ruts in the hard-packed earth and a scattering of torn posters promising miracles and entertainment. She stood there in her performance dress, the sequined blue fabric already gathering dust, clutching her carpetbag with white knuckles as the September heat of 1883 beat down on her bare shoulders. 23 years old, and stranded in the middle of nowhere with $17 to her name and nowhere to go. Globe, Arizona was not much to look at in the harsh light of mid-morning. The mining town sprawled across the landscape, like someone had taken a handful of buildings and tossed them carelessly at the base of the Pinal Mountains. Helena could see the main street from where she stood on the empty lot where the carnival had been, could count maybe 24 structures that looked permanent enough to survive a strong wind. The rest were tents and shanties thrown up by prospectors and miners hoping to strike it rich in the silver deposits that had brought this whole ramshackle community into existence just a few years prior. She walked slowly toward the town proper, her performance shoes kicking up little puffs of dust with each step. The carpetbag felt heavier with every yard, as though the weight of her situation was somehow transferring itself into her belongings. Everything she owned in the world was in that bag. 3 dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, her juggling pins, a deck of cards so worn the faces were barely visible, and the silk scarves she used for her magic act. 5 years traveling with the carnival, 5 years of barely scraping by, and this was what she had to show for it. The main street of Globe was already bustling despite the heat. Miners trudged toward the shafts on the outskirts of town, their faces set in grim determination. A few women in practical calico dresses swept storefronts or carried baskets of goods. Helena felt acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her costume, how the sequins caught the light and drew every eye. She ducked her head and hurried toward what looked like a general store, hoping to find some information about a boarding house or somewhere she could stay while she figured out her next move. She was so focused on not meeting anyone's gaze that she nearly collided with the horse. The animal sidestepped with a snort, and Helena stumbled backward, dropping her carpetbag. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her before she could fall into the dust. She looked up into a pair of startlingly green eyes set in a sun-weathered face beneath the brim of a battered hat. "Easy there," the man said, his voice a low drawl that seemed to match the lazy way he was looking at her. "You all right?" Helena nodded, too flustered to speak. The man was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean build of someone who spent most of his time in the saddle. He wore dusty denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a vest that had seen better days. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster worn smooth from use. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw shadowed with a few days of stubble. He could have been anywhere from 25 to 35, the sun making it hard to tell. "I am fine," Helena managed, stepping back from his grip. "Thank you, I apologize. I was not watching where I was going." The man bent to pick up her carpetbag, and she saw his eyes flick over her costume, taking in the sequins and the theatrical cut of the fabric. When he straightened and handed the bag back to her, there was something curious in his expression. "You with that carnival that was camped out on the edge of town?" he asked. The words hit her like a physical blow. Helena felt her throat tighten and she had to swallow twice before she could answer. I was, she said quietly. They appear to have left without me. The man's eyebrows rose. Left without you? How does a carnival forget one of its own? Helena felt heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. I went into town to purchase supplies. When I returned, they were gone. I suppose they did not notice my absence. That was not quite true. Helena knew exactly why the carnival had left her behind. She had caught Silas Carmichael, the carnival owner's son, stealing from the take 3 days ago and had threatened to expose him. He must have convinced his father to abandon her here rather than risk her telling the other performers. But she was not about to explain all that to this stranger, no matter how kind his eyes seemed. The man was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then he glanced around the street, taking in the curious looks they were drawing from passers-by. You have a place to stay? Not yet, Helena admitted. I was just looking for a boarding house. There is one about 3 buildings down on the left, the man said, pointing. Mrs. Sullivan runs it. She is fair, but the rates are steep for what you get, mining town prices. He paused, then seemed to come to some decision. Look, I do not mean to pry into your business, but if you are looking for work, this town could use your talents. Helena blinked at him. I beg your pardon, your talents, he repeated, gesturing vaguely at her costume. You perform, right? Magic tricks, juggling, that sort of thing. Yes, but I do not see how that would help me here. This does not seem like the kind of town that has much use for entertainment. The man actually smiled at that, a slow spread of warmth that changed his entire face. That is exactly why this town needs it. You have 300 men working themselves to death in silver mines, living in tents and shanties, spending their evenings drinking rotgut whiskey in saloons because there is nothing else to do. Trust me, they would pay good money to see something different, something that reminds them there is more to life than digging in the dark. Helena considered this. It made a certain amount of sense, though the idea of performing on her own was daunting. She had always been part of a larger show, always had the safety net of other acts and the carnival's infrastructure. But what choice did she have? She could not afford to stay in a boarding house for more than a week or 2 at most, and there was no telling when another carnival might pass through this remote corner of Arizona. I suppose I could try, she said slowly, but I would not know where to begin. I do not have a venue or any way to advertise. The man shifted his weight, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his saddle. What if I helped you? I know most of the business owners in town. I could probably arrange for you to use the back room at the Silver Queen Saloon. It is the biggest in town, has a little stage where they sometimes have piano players, and I could spread the word, get people interested. Helena looked at him suspiciously. Why would you do that? You do not even know me. No, I do not, he agreed. But I do know what it is like to be stranded somewhere with no prospects and no help. Someone gave me a chance when I needed it. Figure I should pass that along when I can. He extended his hand. Name is Isaac Xavier. I run a small cattle operation about 5 miles outside town. Spend most of my time these days supplying beef to the mining camps in the town. Helena hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was firm and warm, calloused from hard work. Helena Fairmont, and I appreciate the offer, Mr. Xavier, truly, but I do not want charity. It is not charity, Isaac said, releasing her hand. If you can provide entertainment that keeps the miners in town spending their money instead of riding out to the camps or causing trouble, the business owners will be happy. And if they are happy, they are more likely to buy my beef at fair prices. So really, I am being selfish. He said it with such a straight face that it took Helena a moment to realize he was joking. Despite everything, she felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. That is a very creative justification, Mr. Xavier. Call me Isaac, he said. And what do you say? Want to give it a try? Helena looked around the dusty street, at the ramshackle buildings and the hard-faced miners and the unforgiving landscape stretching in every direction. She thought about her $17 and her limited options, and the fact that the next town of any size was probably days of travel away through country. She had no idea how to navigate. Then she looked back at Isaac Xavier, at his steady green eyes and the faint smile still playing at the corners of his mouth, and she made her decision. "All right," she said. "I will give it a try." The boarding house Isaac had pointed out was a narrow two-story building with a sagging porch and faded paint. Mrs. Sullivan turned out to be a stern-faced woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that took in every detail of Helena's appearance in one swift glance. She quoted a price of $3 a week for a small room with 2 meals a day, which Helena knew was outrageous but had no choice but to accept. She paid for 2 weeks upfront, watching her precious savings dwindle with a sick feeling in her stomach, and followed Mrs. Sullivan up a narrow staircase to a room that was barely large enough for the narrow bed and washstand it contained. "No men allowed upstairs," Mrs. Sullivan said firmly. "No alcohol in the rooms. No loud noises after 9 in the evening. Breakfast is at 6, supper is at 6. If you miss it, you do not eat. Understood?" "Yes, madam," Helena said quietly. Mrs. Sullivan's expression softened just slightly. "I saw you talking to Isaac Xavier out front. That is a good man, one of the few around here worth knowing. If he is helping you, you are in good hands. But you watch yourself anyway. This is a rough town, and a woman alone has to be careful." "I will be careful," Helena promised. After Mrs. Sullivan left, Helena sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let herself feel the full weight of her situation for the first time. She was alone in a strange town with no friends, no connections, and barely any money. The Carnival had been her home for 5 years, the only real family she had known since her parents died of cholera when she was 17. The other performers had not been particularly kind or welcoming, but at least they had been familiar. At least she had known what to expect from day to day. Now she had nothing but the word of a stranger that she might be able to make a living here. And even if Isaac Xavier was as good as his word, even if she could perform and earn money, how long could she sustain that? A few weeks? A few months? What happened when the novelty wore off and the miners grew tired of her act? Helena forced herself to take a deep breath and push those thoughts away. She could not afford to fall apart now. She needed to focus on the immediate future, on getting through the next few days and weeks. Everything else would have to wait. She changed out of her performance dress and into one of her plain cotton gowns, then washed her face and hands in the basin on the washstand. The water was lukewarm and smelled faintly of minerals, but it felt good to scrub away the dust and sweat of the morning. She was just pinning her dark hair back into a neat bun when she heard a knock at her door. Isaac Xavier stood in the hallway, hat in hand. He had cleaned up since their encounter on the street, his face freshly shaved and his shirt changed to a cleaner one, though still well worn. Mrs. Sullivan hovered behind him on the stairs, clearly prepared to enforce her no men upstairs rule if necessary. "I talked to Bill Harrison, who owns the Silver Queen," Isaac said without preamble. "He is willing to let you use the back room for performances. He will take 20% of whatever you charge for admission, and you can keep the rest. I told him you would start tomorrow night if that works for you." Helena felt her heart start to race. Tomorrow night. That gave her barely 24 hours to prepare, to figure out what she was going to perform and how to make it work without the props and support she was used to having. But she forced herself to nod calmly. Tomorrow night will be fine. What do you think I should charge? 2 bits to get in, Isaac said. That is low enough that most miners can afford it, but high enough that you will make decent money if you get a good crowd. I will help you make some posters this afternoon if you like. We can put them up around town. You have done more than enough already, Helena said, though she was grateful for the offer. I can manage the posters myself. Isaac shook his head. You do not know the town. You do not know which saloons are safe to go into and which ones you should avoid, or which stores will let you post notices and which ones will chase you off. Let me help. Besides, I want to see this work. I was not lying when I said this town needs something like this. Helena looked at him for a long moment, trying to understand why he was being so kind to her. She had learned long ago that most people did not do things without expecting something in return. But there was nothing calculating in Isaac's expression, no hidden agenda that she could detect. He just seemed like someone who genuinely wanted to help. All right, she said finally. Thank you. I appreciate it more than you know. They spent the afternoon making posters. Isaac procured paper and ink from the general store, and Helena used her best handwriting to create announcements promising an evening of magic, juggling, and wonder, performed by the talented Miss Helena Fairmont, lately of the famous Carmichael traveling carnival. She embellished the carnival's reputation considerably, but she figured no one in Globe would know the difference. Isaac carried the posters around town, talking to shop owners and saloon keepers, charming them into letting him tack up the notices in prominent locations. Helena watched him work and was struck by how well-liked he seemed to be. People greeted him by name, asked after his cattle, treated him with respect. You have been here a while, she observed as they walked from the general store to the post office. About 3 years, Isaac confirmed. Came out from Texas with a small herd and an even smaller amount of sense. I got lucky. The timing was right. The mines were just starting to boom and they needed beef. I was able to build up my operation pretty quickly. Do you like it here? Isaac glanced at her, then looked out at the mountains rising in the distance. It is a hard place, he said slowly. Unforgiving. The heat in summer is brutal and the winter storms can be vicious. The work never stops, and most of the people you meet are either desperate or dangerous or both. But there is something about it that gets into your blood. The space, I guess. The feeling that you can see forever in every direction, that if you are strong enough and stubborn enough, you can make something of yourself. Does that make sense? I think so, Helena said, though in truth she was not sure she did. She had spent most of her life in crowded cities or traveling from town to town with the carnival. The idea of staying in one place, of putting down roots, was foreign to her. But there was something in the way Isaac talked about the land that made her want to understand. By the time the sun started to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they had posted notices all over town. Isaac walked Helena back to the boarding house, his horse following behind them like a patient dog. You should get a good crowd tomorrow night, he said as they stood on the porch. Word spreads fast in a town this size. Everyone will be curious about the carnival performer. I hope I can live up to their expectations, Helena said quietly. Isaac looked at her seriously. You will be fine. You have been doing this for years, right? Just do what you have always done. They are not expecting anything fancy. They just want to be entertained for a little while, to forget about the back-breaking work and the dust and the heat. You can give them that. Helena wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel the confidence he seemed to have in her. But all she could think about was the fact that she had always had other performers to fall back on, had always been part of a larger show. Now it was just her, alone on a stage, with no one to cover for her mistakes. "Thank you for everything you have done today," she said instead of voicing her fears. "I do not know how I would have managed without your help." "You would have figured it out," Isaac said with certainty. "You seem like the kind of person who always lands on her feet." He settled his hat back on his head and gathered his horse's reins. "I will see you tomorrow night. I will be in the front row." He tipped his hat to her and swung up into his saddle with easy grace, then rode off down the street. Helena watched him go, feeling oddly bereft. It was strange how quickly she had come to rely on his presence, on his steady confidence and easy kindness. She barely knew him, but already she found herself looking forward to seeing him again. She went inside to the dining room for supper, which turned out to be a surprisingly good beef stew and fresh bread. The other boarders were all men, miners and prospectors who ate in silence and left as quickly as they could. Helena was grateful for their lack of interest in her. She was too nervous about the next evening to make small talk. That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town outside her window, Helena went through her act in her mind. She would start with juggling, which always drew a crowd and got people's attention. Then some card tricks, the simple ones that looked impressive but were not too difficult to pull off. After that, the silk scarves and sleight of hand magic that had always been her specialty. She would finish with her favorite trick, the one where she made a coin appear to pass through a solid table. It was all misdirection and practice, but it never failed to amaze people. She could do this. She had to do this. Failure was not an option. The next day passed in a blur of anxiety. Helena spent the morning practicing in her room, running through each trick over and over until her hands moved automatically. She had lunch at a small restaurant near the boarding house, forcing herself to eat even though her stomach was tied in knots. In the afternoon, she took her costume to a woman who did laundry and pressing, paying precious coins to have the sequins cleaned and the fabric freshened. She wanted to look her best, to appear professional and polished. As evening approached, Helena dressed carefully in her performance outfit, pinning her hair into an elaborate arrangement and applying a touch of rouge to her cheeks and lips. She looked at herself in the small, cloudy mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked confident, poised, ready. She only hoped the exterior matched what was happening inside. The Silver Queen Saloon was already crowded when Helena arrived just before 7. The main room was packed with miners and townspeople, all drinking and talking loudly. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies and spilled alcohol. Helena made her way through the crowd to the back room, where Bill Harrison, a portly man with impressive mutton chops, was waiting for her. "You have got a full house," he said, looking pleased. "Standing room only. They are all curious about you. Try not to disappoint them, all right. I've got a reputation to maintain." Helena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She could hear the noise from the crowd, could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. She set up her props on the small stage, arranging everything just so, then stood in the wings and waited for Bill to introduce her. When he walked out onto the stage and called for quiet, the noise barely diminished. But when he announced that the show was about to begin, that Globe was fortunate enough to have a real carnival performer in their midst, the crowd settled into expectant silence. Helena took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out onto the stage. The lights from the oil lamps were hot on her face, and the crowd was a sea of unfamiliar faces, all watching her with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. She scanned the room and found Isaac in the front, exactly where he had promised he would be. He gave her an encouraging nod, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. She began with the juggling, 3 pins at first, then 4, then 5. The crowd watched with polite interest, a few people clapping when she caught all 5 pins at once. She moved on to card tricks, calling up volunteers from the audience to pick cards and have them appear in impossible places. That got more reaction, some laughs and surprised exclamations. She was starting to relax, starting to find her rhythm. Then she pulled out the silk scarves, and the room went completely silent. She wove them through her fingers, made them appear and disappear, changed their colors with sleight of hand so subtle even she could barely see how she did it. The scarves seemed to float on air, to move of their own accord. It was her best work, the act she had spent years perfecting, and the crowd was mesmerized. She finished with the coin trick, borrowing a silver dollar from a man in the front row and making it pass through the solid wood table on the stage. The man examined the table afterward, running his hands over the surface, clearly baffled. The crowd erupted in applause. Helena stood there for a moment, breathing hard, hardly daring to believe it had gone so well. Then Bill was beside her, grinning widely and counting out bills. 87 people paid to get in, he said. Minus my 20%, that is about $17 for you. Not bad for an hour's work. $17. As much as she had had to her name when she arrived in Globe yesterday. Helena took the money with shaking hands, hardly able to process it. She had done it. She had actually done it. The crowd pressed forward, minors wanting to talk to her, to ask how she did her tricks, to tell her how much they had enjoyed the show. Helena answered as best she could, deflecting questions about her methods and accepting compliments with as much grace as she could muster. Through it all, she was aware of Isaac waiting patiently at the edge of the crowd. When the crowd finally dispersed and people started drifting back to the main room of the saloon, Isaac approached her. "That was incredible," he said simply. "You are really talented, Helena." The use of her first name sent a little thrill through her, though she was not quite sure why. "Thank you," she said. "And thank you for encouraging me to do this. I do not think I would have had the courage without your help." "You would have found it eventually," Isaac said, "but I am glad I could help." He glanced toward the door, where the night sky was visible beyond the smoky interior of the saloon. "Can I walk you back to the boarding house? It is not safe for a woman alone after dark." Helena gathered her props and followed him out into the cool evening air. The temperature had dropped significantly since the afternoon, and she shivered slightly in her thin costume. Isaac immediately shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body heat and smelled like leather and horses and something else she could not quite identify, something distinctly masculine. "You do not have to do that," she protested. "You will be cold." "I will be fine," Isaac said. "I am used to it." They walked slowly through the quiet streets, their footsteps echoing off the buildings. Helena was acutely aware of Isaac beside her, of the solid warmth of his presence. She had known him for less than 2 days, but already he felt familiar in a way that should have been impossible. "Will you do more shows?" Isaac asked as they turned onto the street where the boarding house stood. "I think so," Helena said, "if people keep coming." Bill seemed pleased with the turnout. "They will keep coming," Isaac assured her. "You gave them something they have not had in months, maybe years. Something beautiful and mysterious and completely different from their daily lives. They will be back, and they will bring their friends." Helena hoped he was right. $17 was good money, but it would not last long, especially with the boarding house rates. She would need to perform regularly to make a real living here. But for the first time since the carnival had abandoned her, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. They reached the boarding house, and Helena reluctantly shrugged out of Isaac's jacket and handed it back to him. "Thank you again," she said, "for everything." Isaac looked at her for a long moment, and in the dim light from the saloon across the street his eyes were dark and unreadable. "You are welcome," he said quietly. "Get some rest. You earned it." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, leading his horse behind him. Helena watched until he disappeared into the darkness, then went inside, her mind full of silk scarves and silver dollars and green eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully maintained defenses. Over the next few weeks, Helena settled into a routine. She performed at the Silver Queen 3 times a week, on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday nights. The crowd stayed strong, sometimes even growing as word spread to the mining camps outside town. She refined her act, adding new tricks and perfecting old ones. She bought better props with her earnings and a few new dresses, both for performing and for everyday wear. She paid Mrs. Sullivan on time every week and even managed to save a little money. And through it all, Isaac Xavier was a constant presence. He came to every performance, always sitting in the front row, always giving her that encouraging nod before she started. Afterward, he walked her back to the boarding house, and they would talk about everything and nothing. He told her about his ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in the harsh Arizona landscape, about his plans to expand his operation. She told him about her life with the Carnival, about the towns she had seen and the people she had met. She even told him about her parents, about watching them die when she was too young to understand why the medicine was not working, why they kept getting weaker no matter how much she prayed. Isaac listened to it all with quiet attention, never judging, never offering empty platitudes. He just listened, and somehow that was enough. Helena tried not to think too much about what was happening between them. She tried not to notice the way her heart sped up when she saw him, or the way his touch lingered when he helped her over rough patches in the street, or the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention. She had learned long ago not to trust feelings like these. The Carnival had taught her that people left, that connections were temporary, that the only person you could really count on was yourself. But Isaac made it hard to remember those lessons. He was so steady, so reliable, so genuinely kind that it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain her emotional distance. And if she was honest with herself, she was not sure she wanted to anymore. It was early October, about 6 weeks after Helena had arrived in Globe, when things changed. She had just finished a particularly successful performance, the crowd larger than ever, and Isaac was waiting for her as usual. But instead of offering to walk her home, he shifted his weight nervously and cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you might like to come out to the ranch tomorrow," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "For supper, I mean. I know you do not have a performance scheduled, and I thought maybe you would like to see the place. I am not much of a cook, but I can manage a decent steak, and the view of the sunset from the porch is something special." Helena felt her breath catch in her throat. This felt different from their previous interactions, more deliberate, more intimate. A line was being crossed, and they both knew it. She could say no, could maintain the careful boundaries she had built around herself. Or she could take a chance, could let herself feel something real for the first time in longer than she cared to remember. "I would like that very much," she heard herself say. Isaac's face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look younger. "Good. I will come by for you around 4 tomorrow afternoon if that works. It is about an hour's ride out to the ranch." The next afternoon, Helena dressed carefully in one of her nicer day dresses, a dark green cotton with a simple cut that was practical but flattering. She pinned her hair back neatly and then unpinned it, letting it fall in loose waves around her shoulders. Then she pinned it back again, feeling ridiculous for caring so much about her appearance. This was just supper, Just two friends sharing a meal, nothing more, except it felt like more and she knew it. Isaac arrived precisely at 4 on a sturdy bay horse, leading a gentle-looking mare for Helena to ride. "This is Daisy," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She is the most patient horse I have ever known. She will take good care of you." Helena had ridden a little bit when she was younger, before her parents died, but it had been years. She was relieved when Isaac helped her into the saddle and Daisy stood perfectly still, waiting for her to get settled. They rode out of town at an easy pace, heading west toward the mountains. The landscape was harsh but beautiful in its own way. The earth was red and rocky, dotted with saguaro cacti and scrubby mesquite trees. In the distance, the Pinal Mountains rose against the sky, their peaks still holding a hint of snow from the previous winter. The air was clear and dry, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Isaac's ranch, when they reached it, was modest but well-maintained. The house was a simple adobe structure with a covered porch and a few windows. Behind it were a barn, several corrals, and a windmill that creaked as it turned in the breeze. Cattle grazed in the distance, their forms dark against the reddish earth. "It is not much," Isaac said, dismounting and helping Helena down from Daisy, "but it is mine." Helena looked around, taking in the neat fences and the well-tended garden beside the house and the way everything seemed to fit naturally into the landscape. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. "You have built something real here." Something in Isaac's expression softened. "Come on," he said. "Let me show you around." He gave her a tour of the property, pointing out where he planned to expand the corrals, the new breeding stock he had purchased last month, the irrigation system he was working on for the garden. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Helena found herself genuinely interested in the details of ranch life. There was something appealing about the permanence of it, the way Isaac was building something that would last. When the tour was finished, Isaac started a fire in the outdoor cooking area and prepared steaks while Helena sat on the porch and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. He had been right about the view. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, the colors reflecting off the mountains and painting the whole world in fire. It was the most beautiful thing Helena had seen in a long time. They ate on the porch as the stars began to emerge, the steaks perfectly cooked and served with beans and fresh bread. Isaac had even managed to procure a bottle of wine from somewhere, though he admitted with a self-deprecating grin that he had no idea if it was any good. "It is perfect," Helena assured him, sipping the wine and feeling it warm her from the inside. "All of this is perfect." Isaac looked at her across the small table, and in the lamplight his expression was serious. "Helena, I need to tell you something, and I hope it does not make things awkward between us." Helena set down her wine glass, her heart suddenly pounding. "All right. I know we have only known each other for a few weeks," Isaac began slowly. "And I know your life has been uncertain lately, that you are probably still figuring out what comes next. But I need you to know that these past weeks have meant something to me. You have meant something to me. When I am around you, everything feels lighter somehow. Easier. Like the world is not quite as hard as it usually is." Helena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Isaac, let me finish," he said gently. "I am not trying to pressure you into anything. I know you might not feel the same way, or you might not be ready for this kind of thing. But I needed to be honest with you. I care about you, Helena. More than I probably should after such a short time." Helena stood up from the table and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the darkening landscape. She could feel Isaac behind her, waiting patiently for her response. She thought about the carnival leaving her behind, about all the years of never staying in one place, never forming real connections, never letting herself want more than the temporary safety of constant movement. She thought about how tired she was of that life, how lonely it had been even when she was surrounded by people. And she thought about Isaac, about his kindness and his steadiness, and the way he made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could trust someone again. She turned to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made him stand and cross the porch to her. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "It terrifies me, but I do. I have spent so long not letting myself feel anything for anyone, and then you came along and made it impossible to keep those walls up." Isaac reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. His palms were rough with calluses, but his touch was incredibly tender. "You do not have to be scared," he said. "I am not going anywhere. I am not going to leave you behind." The words broke something open inside Helena, and she felt tears spill down her cheeks. Isaac wiped them away with his thumbs, and then he was kissing her, soft and careful and full of unspoken promises. Helena kissed him back, letting herself fall into the moment, into the feeling of being wanted and cared for and safe. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Not just tonight, but in Globe. Stay and build a life here with me." It was too fast, too much, too soon. Helena knew that logically. But her heart, that traitorous organ that had been locked away for so long, was screaming yes. "I do not know if I can," she admitted. "I do not know how to stay in one place. I do not know how to be with someone like this." "We will figure it out together," Isaac said. "I do not have all the answers either, but I know that what we have is worth trying for. Is that enough?" Helena thought about it, really thought about it, and then she smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes," she said, "that is enough." They stood on the porch for a long time after that, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. Helena felt something settle inside her, something that had been restless and anxious for as long as she could remember. She was still scared, still uncertain about the future, but for the first time she could see a path forward that did not involve running away. Isaac insisted on riding back to town with her that night, even though it meant an extra 2 hours in the saddle for him. They rode slowly, reluctant to let the evening end. When they reached the boarding house, he helped her down from Daisy and held her close for a long moment. "I will see you Wednesday at your performance," he said. "You do not have to come to every show," Helena protested, though she secretly loved that he did. "I want to," Isaac said simply. "Besides, I need to make sure all those miners treat you with respect. Someone has to look out for you." Helena laughed. "I can take care of myself." "I know you can," Isaac said, kissing her forehead. "But that does not mean you have to." As the weeks turned into months, Helena and Isaac's relationship deepened. They were careful about it at first, aware that a small town like Globe could be unforgiving of impropriety. But there was no hiding the way they looked at each other, the way Isaac attended every performance without fail, the way Helena's face lit up whenever he entered a room. Helena continued to perform at the Silver Queen, her shows becoming a staple of Globe's limited entertainment offerings. She expanded her act, bringing in new tricks and even beginning to train a few local children who showed interest in learning sleight of hand. The money was steady, and she was able to save a decent amount each month. But more and more, she found herself thinking about Isaac's ranch, about the life he was building there. She started spending Sundays out at the property, helping him with small tasks around the house and learning about ranch life. He taught her to ride properly, to recognize the signs of a sick cow, to read the weather by watching the clouds over the mountains. She taught him card tricks and made him laugh with stories from her carnival days. It was on a cold December afternoon, with the first real winter storm threatening on the horizon, that Isaac brought up the future again. They were sitting in his small living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, drinking coffee and watching the clouds gather. "I have been thinking," Isaac said carefully, "about next year, about what comes next for us." Helena set down her coffee cup and looked at him. "What have you been thinking?" "I want you here permanently," Isaac said bluntly, "not just visiting on Sundays. I want you to live here, to make this your home. I want to marry you, Helena, if you will have me." Helena felt her breath catch. They had been dancing around this topic for weeks, both of them aware that their relationship was heading in this direction, but neither quite willing to take the final step. "Isaac, I do not know if I would make a good wife. I do not know anything about running a household or being a rancher's wife. Everything I know is about performing, about moving from place to place. I do not care about any of that," Isaac said, taking her hands in his. "I care about you, about who you are, not what you know how to do. We will figure out the rest as we go. But I need you to know that I am serious about this, about us. I love you, Helena Fairmont, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." It was the first time he had said those words, and they hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Helena looked at his face, at the earnest hope in his eyes, and she realized that somewhere along the way, without even meaning to, she had fallen completely in love with this man. This kind, steady, impossibly patient man who had taken a chance on a stranded carnival performer and given her not just a place to stay but a reason to believe in something permanent. "I love you too," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "And yes, I will marry you. I do not know how to be a rancher's wife, but I will learn. I want to learn. I want to build a life with you." Isaac pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, and Helena felt the last of her defenses crumble. She was tired of protecting herself, tired of holding back. She wanted this. She wanted him. She wanted the life they could build together. They were married 3 weeks later on a cold January morning in 1884 in the small church that served Globe and the surrounding area. The ceremony was simple, with just a handful of friends in attendance. Bill Harrison from the Silver Queen stood as Isaac's witness, and Mrs. Sullivan, who had softened considerably toward Helena over the months, stood as hers. Helena wore a new dress she had made herself, a pale blue wool that brought out her eyes. Isaac wore his best suit, which was still a bit worn at the elbows but clean and neat. The preacher spoke about commitment and partnership and building a life together. Helena barely heard him. She was too focused on Isaac, on the way he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, on the promises they were making to each other. When it came time for the vows, her voice was steady and clear. She meant every word. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the Silver Queen. Helena performed one last show as a single woman, pulling out all her best tricks to the delight of the assembled crowd. It was bittersweet, knowing that this chapter of her life was ending. But when Isaac took her hand and led her outside to the wagon he had prepared for the journey back to the ranch, she felt nothing but excitement for what came next. The ranch became Helena's home in more than just name. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to tend the garden, to preserve food for the winter. She learned to handle the chickens Isaac brought home one day and to milk the cow he purchased from a neighbor. She was not naturally gifted at any of these tasks, and there were plenty of disasters along the way: burned meals, gardens overtaken by weeds, bread that came out of the oven hard as a brick. But Isaac was patient, and slowly she improved. She also continued to perform, though less frequently. Once a month she would go into town and put on a show at the Silver Queen, and the crowds were as enthusiastic as ever. The money was useful. helping to fund improvements to the ranch. But more than that, Helena found she missed performing when she did not do it regularly. It was part of who she was, and Isaac never once suggested she should give it up completely. "You are not just a rancher's wife," he told her one evening as she practiced a new card trick at the kitchen table. "You are Helena. You have talents and skills that are yours alone. I would never want you to give that up for me." It was moments like that, small and quiet and profound, that made Helena fall even more deeply in love with her husband. He saw her completely, all of her, and loved her not despite her differences but because of them. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. The summer of 1884 was brutally hot, and they lost several head of cattle to the heat and lack of water. Money was tight, and there were weeks when they ate nothing but beans and cornbread. A fire in the barn that October destroyed some of their equipment and nearly killed one of the horses. There were moments when Helena wondered if they would make it, if the ranch would survive, if their young marriage could withstand the constant pressure. But they worked through it together, and somehow that made all the difference. When the rains finally came in November, turning the desert briefly green, Helena stood on the porch and watched Isaac ride through the recovering land, and she felt a fierce pride in what they had endured. They had survived their first year, and they would survive whatever came next. In the spring of 1885, Helena realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but it was not until Dr. Morris in town confirmed it that she allowed herself to believe it. She was going to have a baby. She and Isaac were going to be parents. She told him that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. She had planned something elaborate, some clever way to break the news, but in the end, she just blurted it out. "I am pregnant." Isaac froze for a moment, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Then he set the cup down carefully and turned to her, his eyes wide. "You are certain?" "Dr. Morris confirmed it today," Helena said. "The baby should come in November, he thinks." Isaac let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to be parents," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Helena, we are going to have a baby." "I know," Helena said, holding on to him tightly. "I am terrified." "We will figure it out," Isaac assured her, his hands gentle on her face. "Just like we figured everything else out, together." The months of Helena's pregnancy passed quickly. Isaac became ridiculously overprotective, constantly worried that she was working too hard or lifting something too heavy. Helena found it simultaneously endearing and infuriating. She continued to do her shows in town until she was 7 months along, at which point the traveling became too uncomfortable. She spent those last months preparing the small spare room in the house as a nursery, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, reading every book on childbirth and infant care she could get her hands on. The baby arrived on a cold November night during the first snowfall of the season. Helena's labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours. Dr. Morris stayed with them the entire time, along with Mrs. Sullivan, who had become something of a surrogate mother to Helena. Isaac paced the living room like a caged animal, unable to help, feeling utterly useless. But when it was finally over, when Dr. Morris placed a squalling, red-faced infant in Helena's arms, Isaac thought his heart might burst from the sheer intensity of his emotions. They had a son. A healthy, beautiful son with a full head of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. "What should we name him?" Helena asked, exhausted but glowing. They had discussed names extensively but had never quite agreed on one. Isaac looked at his son, at his wife, at the family they had created together, and he knew exactly what the child should be called. "Henry," he said. "Henry Xavier, after your father." Helena's eyes filled with tears. She had told Isaac about her father, about how kind he had been, how he had always encouraged her interest in magic and sleight of hand, even when her mother thought it was unladylike. Naming their son after him felt like completing a circle, like honoring the past while building the future. Henry Xavier, Helena repeated softly. It is perfect. Parenthood changed them both in ways they had not expected. The sleepless nights were brutal, and there were days when Helena thought she might lose her mind from exhaustion. But there were also moments of pure joy. Henry's first smile, his first laugh, the way he reached for them with tiny, grasping hands. Isaac was a devoted father, getting up for middle-of-the-night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in his rough, tuneless voice that somehow always soothed the baby. By the time Henry was 6 months old, Helena was ready to start performing again. Isaac's mother came from Texas to help with the baby, a practical woman named Margaret who was thrilled to have a grandchild to dote on. With her help, Helena was able to go into town once a month for shows. The audiences welcomed her back enthusiastically, and it felt good to be on stage again, to be Helena Fairmont Xavier the performer, not just Henry's mother or Isaac's wife. The next few years passed in a blur of hard work and small joys. The ranch prospered, Isaac's herd growing steadily. They were able to hire help, a young man named Tom who came from one of the mining camps and proved to be a hard worker. Helena's performances became legendary in Globe and the surrounding areas. People came from miles away to see the magic woman, as they called her. She even began teaching a regular class for children interested in learning basic tricks, holding sessions in the back room of the Silver Queen every Saturday afternoon. Henry grew into a bright, curious toddler, then an active boy who loved following his father around the ranch. When he was 3, Helena realized she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and when their daughter arrived in the spring of 1889, Helena hardly recognized herself in the capable, confident woman she had become. They named the baby Emma, after Isaac's grandmother. She had Isaac's green eyes and Helena's dark hair, and from the moment she was born, she had both of them wrapped around her tiny finger. Henry was initially skeptical of the new addition, but quickly became fiercely protective of his baby sister. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Isaac continued to expand the ranch, eventually purchasing adjacent land and nearly doubling their property. Helena balanced performing, teaching, and raising their children, somehow making it all work through sheer determination and Isaac's unfailing support. They had struggles: a drought in 1891 that nearly bankrupted them, a bout of scarlet fever that swept through Globe and terrified them when Henry caught it, the constant challenges of making a living in such unforgiving country. But they had each other, and they had built something solid and real. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat on the porch watching the stars, Helena would sometimes think back to that day in 1883 when the Carnival had abandoned her. She would remember the fear and desperation she had felt, standing in that empty lot with nothing but a carpet bag and $17 to her name, and she would feel nothing but gratitude. Because that moment of abandonment had led her to Isaac, had led her to this life she never could have imagined for herself. She had found home in the last place she expected it, with a cowboy who had seen something worth saving in a stranded carnival performer. "What are you thinking about?" Isaac asked one evening in 1895, when they had been married for more than a decade and their children were old enough to mostly take care of themselves. "About how we met," Helena said, leaning against his shoulder. "About how different my life would have been if you had not stopped to help me that day." "I think about that sometimes too," Isaac admitted. "I almost did not stop. I was in a hurry to get to the stockyard, But something made me look at you, really look at you, and I could not just ride past. I am glad you stopped, Helena said softly. I am glad you saw something in me worth taking a chance on. Isaac pulled her closer. I saw someone who was stronger than she knew, someone talented and brave and determined not to let circumstances break her. I knew from the first moment that you were going to be someone special in my life. I just did not know how special. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. In the distance, they could hear Henry practicing his roping skills in the corral, and Emma singing to herself in her room as she got ready for bed. The life they had built together surrounded them, solid and real and good. You ever miss it? Isaac asked suddenly. The carnival, the traveling, that life. Helena considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she admitted. I miss the excitement of new places, the thrill of performing for crowds who have never seen magic before. But I do not miss the uncertainty, the loneliness, the feeling of never belonging anywhere. This is where I belong, Isaac, here with you with our children on this land. This is my home and I would not trade it for anything. Isaac kissed the top of her head. Good. Because I am not letting you go. Ever. They grew old together on that ranch, watching their children grow up and start families of their own. Henry took over more and more of the ranch operations as Isaac aged, eventually running the place almost entirely while his father took on an advisory role. Emma inherited her mother's talent for performance and traveled for a while with a theater company before settling down with a newspaperman in Phoenix. But she always came home for holidays, bringing her husband and eventually her own children to visit the ranch where she had grown up. Helena continued to perform occasionally, even into her 60s, though her shows became less frequent as her joints stiffened, and her hands were not quite as nimble as they once had been. But she never stopped teaching, and there was rarely a Saturday when she did not have a group of children gathered around her, learning the basics of misdirection and sleight of hand. One autumn evening in 1912, when Helena was 62 and Isaac was 65, they sat on the same porch where they had shared so many sunsets, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. Their hands were clasped together, fingers interlocked, both sets marked with age spots and scars from a lifetime of hard work. You remember what you told me the first day we met? Helena asked. You said this town could use my talents. Isaac smiled, the expression creating deep creases in his weathered face. I remember. I meant it too. Globe was a rougher place then. Your shows brought something beautiful into people's lives when they needed it most. You brought something beautiful into my life, Helena said, squeezing his hand. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to stay in one place. You gave me everything, Isaac. We gave each other everything, Isaac corrected gently. You made me believe that I could have more than just a ranch and cattle. You brought color and magic and joy into my life. You made me a better man, Helena. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. Inside the house, they could hear the voices of their grandchildren who were visiting for the weekend. Henry's two boys were arguing good-naturedly over a card game, while Emma's daughter was practicing a juggling routine Helena had been teaching her. We did all right, did not we? Helena said softly. With the life we built together, Isaac brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. We did more than all right. We created something extraordinary. A family, a legacy, a love that has lasted through everything life threw at us. I would not change a single moment of it. Helena rested her head on Isaac's shoulder, feeling utterly content. The carnival had left her behind all those years ago, abandoned her in the middle of nowhere with no prospects and no plan. At the time, it had felt like the end of the world. But it had been the beginning of everything that mattered. She had been found by a cowboy who saw past her circumstances to the person she could become, who had offered her not just opportunity, but genuine kindness and support, who had loved her completely without reservation for more than 30 years. And she had found herself, too. Not the Helena Fairmont who had performed with the Carnival, always moving, never settling, never letting herself want more than temporary safety. But Helena Xavier, wife and mother and teacher and performer, a woman who had put down roots in this harsh, beautiful land and had grown something lasting and true. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle lowing. Emma's daughter came running out onto the porch, eager to show off her improved juggling skills. Henry appeared with his sons, wanting to discuss plans for the next day's work on the ranch. The evening filled with the noise and chaos of family, with love and laughter and the comfortable rhythms of a life well lived. As the years continued to pass, Helena and Isaac remained devoted to each other and to the family and community they had built. Isaac passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1918 at the age of 71, with Helena holding his hand. She grieved deeply, but found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the legacy they had created together. She lived another 15 years, continuing to teach magic to local children and tell stories about the early days of Globe, about the carnival that had left her behind and the cowboy who had changed her life. When Helena passed in 1933, she was surrounded by her family in the same ranch house where she and Isaac had raised their children. Her last words were about Isaac, about how she would see him soon, about how grateful she was for the life they had shared. She was buried next to him on a hill overlooking the ranch, and their headstones bore simple inscriptions that captured the essence of their love. Together forever on his, and home at last on hers. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to the determination and love of the two people who had built it from nothing. The Xavier name became respected throughout Arizona, associated with hard work, integrity, and community service. And in Globe, they still told stories about Helena Fairmont Xavier, the carnival performer who had been abandoned by fate and found by love, who had brought magic and beauty to a rough mining town and had stayed to build something lasting. It was a story of second chances and unexpected grace, of finding home in the most unlikely places. It was the story of a woman who had thought herself lost, discovering that she had actually been exactly where she needed to be. And it was a love story, pure and simple, between two people who had taken a chance on each other and had built something extraordinary from that leap of faith. The carnival had left her behind without warning. A cowboy had found her and told her the town could use her talents. And from that simple beginning had grown a love that lasted a lifetime, a family that spanned generations, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. On summer evenings, when the desert wind whispered through the mesquite trees and the stars emerged brilliant in the vast Arizona sky, people sometimes swore they could still hear the echo of Helena's laughter on the breeze, could almost see Isaac's tall form silhouetted against the sunset. The ranch stood as a monument to their love, to the life they had carved out of the harsh landscape through sheer determination and devotion to each other. Their great-grandchildren would eventually take over the operations, modernizing where necessary, but always maintaining the core values that Helena and Isaac had established. The land continued to produce, the cattle continued to thrive, and the Xavier name remained synonymous with quality and integrity throughout the region. But more than the business success, it was the story of Helena and Isaac that endured, passed down through the generations as a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in life can lead to the greatest blessings, that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that home is not where you come from but where you choose to stay. And so their story concluded not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy well established. The carnival performer who had been abandoned found not just survival but true happiness. The cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger found the love of his life. Together, they built something that lasted far beyond their own years, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and enduring love. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the hardships they had faced or the obstacles they had overcome, but the simple fact that they had found each other, had chosen each other, and had spent their lives building something beautiful together. The town of Globe, Arizona, had indeed needed Helena Fairmont's talents, but Isaac Xavier had needed her even more, and she had needed him. They had saved each other in all the ways that mattered, and their love had become the foundation for everything that followed. The sun continued to rise and set over the ranch. The seasons continued to change, and life continued to flow forward as it always does. But the love story of Helena and Isaac remained constant, a beacon of hope and proof that even when the world seems to abandon you, sometimes fate is actually setting you on the path to exactly where you belong.